This is another podcast from Alpha Business Media. Welcome to another deep dive. We grab a whole stack of sources, articles, research reports, and we try to cut through the noise to get you the most important insights.
Let's say.
Today, we're really digging into a sector that's, well, fundamental to a nation, you know? It touches the lives of way over half its population. We're looking at the modernization of Nepal's agricultural sector.
Yeah, and the source material we're working from today is this pretty comprehensive report. It takes a really hard look at how effective things like new technologies and government subsidies have actually been.
Been in strengthening food security and boosting exports, right?
Exactly. Food
Okay.
security and agricultural exports. Those are the big goals.
So our mission here is pretty straightforward. We want to unpack what this report found, understand the very real challenges Nepal is facing on the ground, and see what lessons, what we can learn from their whole journey trying to bring this vital economic sector into the modern age.
And why should you care about this? Well, agriculture is, you could argue it's the defining sector in Nepal. Historically, it's the absolute backbone.
Employing a huge number of people.
Huge. Around 50% of the population as of 2023. But here's the thing. The report really brings out this striking paradox.
Okay.
Despite employing half the workforce, it only contributed about, 24% to GDP in that same period?
Wow, that's a big gap.
It's a massive gap. And it signals some really deep-seated issues, low productivity, very small farm sizes, high vulnerability to weather, things like that.
So this deep dive is going to show you what's being tried, what the report says is actually working.
And maybe more importantly, what isn't working, and why transforming this sector is such a complex challenge.
That paradox is really the place to start, isn't it? Over half the workers, but less than a quarter of the economic output. What are the fundamental reasons the report gives for that low productivity?
Well, the report points to several core things. A major one is just the widespread use of, traditional farming methods. These just inherently limit yields compared to modern practices.
Makes sense.
Another big factor is how common small-scale farming is. The average farm size is really quite small, maybe half a hectare up to 5 hectares.
That's tiny.
Yeah. And that makes it really difficult and often just not economical for individual farmers to invest in or even properly use expensive modern tech.
And you mentioned whether they're heavily reliant on the monsoon rains, I assume. That leaves them exposed.
Absolutely. Highly dependent on the monsoon. So weather vulnerability, especially with climate change, is a huge risk.
Right.
And then you add on top of that a growing rural labor shortage. Younger people are migrating away for work.
Uh-huh.
And this issue of land fragmentation, where a farmer's land isn't one plot, but scattered across multiple small fields, that just adds another layer of inefficiency. It's a really tough environment to try and boost output.
It really sounds like the report paints a clear picture of a sector, well, struggling with these foundational issues, even though it's so important for jobs.
It does. That high employment share next to a relatively low, maybe even declining GDP share,
Yeah.
it just points to a sector that isn't generating wealth proportionally.
Mm.
And that impacts rural incomes, the whole economy.
So the government sees these problems, they recognize they're severe, and modernization is a priority. What are the main strategies they're using? What does the report highlight?
Well, it highlights the Agriculture Development Strategy, the ADS,
Yeah.
that runs from 2015 to 2035. It's a pretty broad plan aiming for growth across, production, processing, trade, services.
The whole chain?
The whole chain. It actually recommended some pretty substantial spending, like $500 million US a year over 10 years.
Wow.
Yeah. The strategy focuses on bringing smallholders into the fold, improving infrastructure, developing agribusiness, and crucially, investing more in science and technology.
And is there a specific flagship project under that big strategy?
Yes, that's the Prime Minister Agriculture Modernization Project, or PMAMP. It launched around 2016-17.
Okay.
Its key idea is to try and overcome that land fragmentation issue by creating these specialized agricultural zones. They have different sizes, pockets, blocks, zones, right up to super zones focusing on specific crops or commodities.
Concentrating effort.
Exactly. And the PMAMP also provides grants, direct financial help for things like fertilizers, seeds, irrigation, even insurance. The aim is to encourage commercial farming using, scientific management, modern tech, mechanization, climate-smart methods, the works.
So the big goals are pretty clear then. Boost productivity, make sure there's enough food, raise farmer incomes, get more exports going, and rely less on imports. These strategies are meant to tackle those head on.
That's the intention, absolutely. And now the report really digs into whether these strategies, especially through pushing technology and using subsidies, are actually achieving those goals.
Okay, so that brings us right to technology as a driver for modernization. The report looks at different technologies being promoted. What are some of the key ones?
Maybe the most basic, the most fundamental, is adopting improved seeds.
Hmm.
Using high-yielding varieties that are resistant to diseases. That's foundational if you want to increase productivity.
Right, starts with seed.
Exactly. The report actually cites a study from Gulni district that showed a strong preference. Like 76% of farmers there preferred improved maize seeds. And this led to a pretty significant yield increase, maybe 767 kilos per hectare more, and a nice income boost too.
Mm.
But getting these seeds available everywhere and getting farmers to, trust them and actually use them, those are the key challenges.
All right, so better seeds, critical. What about mechanization? You mentioned that labor shortage earlier. That must make machines really important.
Vital. Mechanization is crucial. Things like tractors, mini-tillers, seeders, reapers, they can drastically cut down on labor costs, reduce losses, and just make things more efficient.
But are farmers actually using them much?
Well, that's the thing. The report notes adoption is still quite low overall. A few years back, only a small fraction, maybe 8%, were using tractors. Now, the government does subsidize buying machinery.
Uh-huh.
But actually getting that machinery into the hands of lots of small farmers, that's still a major hurdle.
And water management, given the monsoon dependence and, as you said, limited arable land, that must be absolutely essential.
Paramount. Yeah, only about 29% of Nepal's land is arable, and irrigation really depends heavily on rivers. The report points out something interesting here.
Oh, yeah.
Just increasing the efficiency of the existing irrigation systems, like these farmer-managed irrigation systems, which cover about 70% of irrigated land, just making those canals maybe 30% more efficient.
Okay.
Could lead to huge national yield increases for staple crops like rice, maize, wheat. We're talking potentially 3 tons per hectare nationally.
Wow, just from being more efficient with water they already have access to.
Pretty much. And things like drip irrigation are also highlighted as having a lot of potential, especially for farming during the dry seasons.
That potential yield boost from better irrigation is really striking. What about the really cutting edge stuff? Digital farming, precision agriculture?
Yeah, this is an area with, well, huge potential down the road, but it's still very much in the early stages of adoption in Nepal.
So what does that involve?
Precision ag uses things like GPS, GIS mapping, sensors, drones, even mobile apps. The idea is to use resources, water, fertilizers, pesticides much more efficiently based on real-time data from the fields.
Sounds smart.
It is. The GeoKrishi platform is mentioned as an example. It gives farmers tailored weather info, farming advice, helps them adapt to climate change. It's reached a lot of people, hundreds of thousands.
Okay.
But the actual use of these advanced digital tools on the farm is still very, very low overall. Pilot projects, initial stages.
So, okay, we see the potential of all these technologies. We see some examples, like with the improved seeds where they've made a difference. But the report also hits this hard reality. Despite all the potential and the promotion, overall tech adoption is still low. Why is that gap so big?
Yeah, the report really breaks down these barriers, and they're all kind of interconnected. Economically, the big one is just the high initial cost of a lot of this tech.
Right, it's expensive.
Very expensive. And that's combined with limited access to credit for small farmers. They often don't have collateral, or they face really high interest rates. Plus, those small, fragmented landholdings we talked about, they just make investing in big, expensive machinery uneconomical for many farmers.
That makes perfect sense. If your farm is just tiny plots scattered around, buying a huge tractor just isn't practical, is it?
Exactly.
What about social barriers?
Socially, there's often low education and awareness. Farmers might simply not know about the technology or not fully understand the benefits or, how to even use it effectively.
Uh-huh.
There's also a lack of skilled people in rural areas for technical support, for repairs, and sometimes just a natural conservatism, a resistance to changing traditional ways of doing things.
And infrastructure must be a massive challenge too, right? Getting things around, power.
Absolutely critical. Poor rural roads make transporting equipment, fertilizers, seeds, everything really difficult and costly. Unreliable electricity grids, patchy internet service sets. Those hinder the use of modern irrigation systems, digital tools, everything.
Yeah.
And if a piece of machinery breaks down, finding a service center, getting spare parts locally, that could be a crippling problem. Stops everything.
And institutionally, are there blockages there too?
Significant ones, yeah. The report points to ineffective extension services, the people who are supposed to be training and advising farmers. Market inefficiencies, volatile prices, these reduce the incentive for farmers to invest in tech to produce more.
Mm.
And sometimes policy inconsistencies or just plain old bureaucracy can create uncertainty and make things complex for farmers trying to access programs or adopt new methods.
So the really key insight here, it sounds like, is that just making technology available or even offering a subsidy for it isn't nearly enough. These deep systemic barriers, economic, social, infrastructure, institutional, they all need to be tackled together for tech adoption to really take off.
Precisely. The report emphasizes that point very strongly. You can't just fix one piece.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly and turn to the government's other major tool for modernization: subsidies. The report spends a lot of time analyzing these, right? Aimed at supporting production, farmers, food security.
Yes, subsidies are a huge part of the picture. The system covers several areas, but by far the largest component, the lion's share of the money, goes to fertilizer subsidies.
Chemical fertilizers specifically.
Chemical fertilizers, yes. The government spends enormous amounts importing and distributing these at subsidized prices. There are also subsidies for seeds, for agricultural machinery, for irrigation infrastructure, and even for agricultural insurance premiums.
And the report gives us some sense of the scale. How much money are we talking about?
It's substantial, really substantial.
Mm.
Over the 5 years from 2019-20 to 2023-24, Nepal allocated over 100 billion Nepali rupees just to agricultural subsidies.
Wow.
But what's really striking is that over 80% of that massive sum, 87 billion NPR, was specifically for chemical fertilizers.
80% just on fertilizer.
Yeah. And this trend looks set to continue. The budget for the upcoming fiscal year dedicates nearly half the entire Ministry of Agriculture's budget just to fertilizer subsidies.
That's an incredible focus. How does this stuff actually get distributed? Who gets it?
Well, it's mainly through state-owned companies for the fertilizers. For other subsidies, like machinery or seeds, it's often channeled through government projects, local cooperatives, or local government authorities.
Uh-huh.
And that PMAMP project we mentioned, that's also a significant channel, distributing billions in direct grants over its first 5 years.
Okay, so with all that money flowing into the system, how effective have these subsidies actually been, according to the report's analysis?
Well, the assessment is pretty mixed and often quite critical, actually.
Okay.
For fertilizer subsidies, yes, consumption did increase, which was one objective, but the impact on overall yield is much more ambiguous. In some remote areas, the report notes, yields even declined after subsidies were introduced.
Declined. Why would that happen?
Possibly due to farmers not using it optimally, maybe using too much or at the wrong time, or potential issues with the quality of the subsidized fertilizer itself.
Okay, and what about the seed subsidies?
The seed subsidy program, which mostly focused on rice since 2012, well, the report says it didn't significantly boost national rice yields.
Why not?
Partly, it suggests, because the program tended to promote older, established varieties rather than newer, potentially more productive ones. So while it might have helped some low-income or remote farmers get access to any improved seed,
Right.
its broader impact on national productivity was limited. And again, it's mostly focused on just two crops, rice and wheat.
So the report finds a statistical correlation between total subsidy spending and overall production, but it still questions the overall effectiveness because of, well, significant systemic problems. What are these problems that seem to plague the subsidy system?
Yeah, this is where the report gets particularly critical. One major issue is just inefficiency and accessibility. The subsidies often don't actually reach the small, marginalized farmers they're supposedly intended for.
How come?
Bureaucracy, lack of information, complex procedures, they all create barriers. The system tends to favor larger farms, or maybe those farmers who are better connected politically or socially.
That sounds deeply unfair. And does corruption creep in?
The report points directly to a serious lack of transparency and weak oversight. This allows for misuse. There are documented instances of subsidized goods, like fertilizers or machinery, being bought cheap and then resold at a higher price on the open market.
Oh, wow.
One estimate cited even suggests that maybe 35% of allocated funds might be lost to, well, commissions for officials involved in the distribution. That kind of thing just erodes trust and wastes huge amounts of public money.
Does it also create a kind of dependence among farmers?
Yes, that's another key problem highlighted. Farmers can become overly reliant on these subsidized inputs. It reduces their incentive to, find more efficient methods or adapt to market signals or maybe even innovate.
Right.
And that heavy bias towards chemical fertilizers, it actively discourages the adoption of more sustainable practices, like using organic manure or compost.
And the environmental risks you mentioned before.
Correct. The overuse of chemical fertilizers, which the subsidy structure encourages, contributes to soil degradation, water pollution. It undermines the long-term health of the whole agricultural ecosystem.
And is anyone actually tracking the impact effectively? Management and monitoring.
That's another weakness. There seems to be a lack of clear data and robust monitoring on the actual impact of these subsidies. Are they really boosting productivity long-term? Are they increasing farmer incomes? Are they encouraging better practices? It's hard to tell, and that makes it very difficult to evaluate what's actually working and adjust the policies effectively.
So the report's conclusion on subsidies sounds pretty blunt then. Huge amounts of money are being spent, but the system is inefficient, riddled with problems, not consistently boosting productivity or incomes, and often failing to reach the most vulnerable farmers it's meant to help.
That's basically the key takeaway, yes. The intention might be good, and the funding is certainly there, but the execution seems fundamentally flawed by these deep systemic issues.
Now, how do these big efforts, the push for technology, this flawed subsidy system, how do they connect back to that crucial national goal of food security?
Well, food security is obviously a primary objective, and the report does note Nepal has made progress. Its global hunger index score has improved, moving from alarming down to moderate.
Okay, so some progress.
Some progress, definitely. But despite that, the problem is really far from solved.
How serious is it still on the ground?
The report highlights that millions of people are still classified as food insecure. And a really significant percentage of households, maybe 22%, simply can't afford even the cheapest, locally available nutritious diet.
And are there big differences across the country?
Huge differences. Yeah, rural areas are generally worse off than urban centers. And the mountain and hill regions are significantly more vulnerable to, like, calorie insecurity compared to the Terai lowlands, the traditional farming belt. Karnali province, way out west, stands out with a particularly high rate of insecurity, over 77%.
And what about vulnerable groups? Children, women?
Yes, the report notes child malnutrition rates, things like stunting, where kids are too short for their age, and wasting, where they're too thin, are still a serious concern. And anemia is common among women and children.
Now, here's a fascinating point the report makes that seems, well, kind of counterintuitive. It says the productive Terai region, the breadbasket, actually has one of the lowest rates of minimum acceptable diet for young children.
Yeah.
How does the report explain that paradox?
Yeah, it's complex, isn't it? And it really shows that just producing a lot of food in a region doesn't automatically mean people living there eat better.
Right. Why not?
Well, there could be several reasons. Maybe the produce grown there is mainly for export or shipped to Kathmandu or other cities. Maybe it's dominated by monocultures like just rice and wheat, which don't provide dietary diversity. Or it could be a lack of knowledge about nutrition at the household level. Or simply economic barriers. People might not be able to afford a varied diet, even if different foods are produced nearby.
So how are technology and subsidies supposed to help food security, and where are they falling short, according to the report?
Well, the idea is that technologies like improved seeds, better irrigation, mechanization, they should increase overall domestic food production, make more food available, stabilize supplies, make production more efficient.
Okay.
And subsidies are meant to lower production costs and boost output, which, in theory, helps ensure food is available and affordable. But, as we've discussed, the ineffectiveness of both tech adoption and the current subsidy programs means they just aren't fully delivering on this potential. Subsidies that promote older, less nutritious staple crop varieties don't really help diversify diets, for example.
And the report flags reliance on food imports as a critical issue related to this.
A major concern, yeah. Food imports have increased dramatically in recent years. They accounted for nearly 18% of Nepal's total imports recently.
Wow.
The food trade deficit has just ballooned over the last decade or so. Nepal is importing basic things, rice, wheat flour, lentils, often even into remote areas, and mostly from India.
And that creates vulnerability.
Absolutely. This high dependence makes the country really vulnerable to global price shocks, supply disruptions, changes in trade policy from its neighbors.
So the modernization efforts could reduce this dependence, but right now, they're not really doing the job effectively.
Exactly. Boosting domestic production of staples through effective tech adoption, actually realizing That potential from better irrigation, reducing post-harvest losses, diversifying what's grown, all that could significantly cut the need for imports. The report basically argues that the current low rate of effective modernization is a direct contributor to this high import vulnerability.
Okay, let's pivot now to the other side of the trade coin, agricultural exports. The report says agriculture accounts for, what, over 40% of Nepal's total exports? That sounds
Yeah,
pretty significant.
it is significant, yeah. Historically, the key products have been things like tea, black cardamom. Nepal is actually the world leader in black cardamom production and ginger.
Interesting.
More recently, though, there's been this huge surge in the export value of processed oils, particularly soybean oil and palm oil.
And the report pointed out a nuance there, didn't it, about those oils?
Yes, and this is really important to understand.
Right.
While those oil exports look massive in value, we're talking tens of billions of NPR, a lot of it involves importing crude oil, say from Thailand or Argentina,
Ah.
processing it in Nepal, and then re-exporting the finished product, mainly across the border to India.
So it's more like processing trade than boosting domestic farming.
Exactly. It's less about boosting Nepal's own agricultural production and more about utilizing processing capacity, often driven by tariff differences with India. So it's valuable, yes, but it's also quite vulnerable to changes in trade policies or raw material prices elsewhere.
Got it. So putting aside those re-exports for a moment, how could technology specifically help boost exports of things actually grown in Nepal, like the cardamom or tea?
Well, technology is key here for both volume and quality. Using improved varieties suitable for export markets, investing in better processing facilities right after harvest, implementing strong quality control measures, these are vital.
Meeting international standards must be tough.
It is, and that requires things like certification, traceability systems. The report mentions GIES technology for cardamom, which is basically a way to track the product from the farm gate right through to the market, giving buyers confidence in quality and origin. And things like better irrigation and mechanization also improve efficiency, which makes Nepali products more price competitive internationally. There's also significant potential, the report suggests, in developing niche, high-value products, specific spices, medicinal herbs, organic certified goods.
And what role could subsidies play in stimulating export-oriented farming? Could they be targeted better?
They certainly could be. Targeted subsidies could be very effective. You could support farmers growing specific export crops, maybe help fund investments in export-enabling infrastructure, like cold storage chains or processing facilities located near production zones.
But the current system isn't doing that.
Not really effectively, no. The current very general subsidy system, heavily focused on inputs like bark fertilizer for domestic consumption, and plagued by those distribution issues we discussed. It doesn't provide a strong stimulus for export production. There's a lack of specific support for improving quality to meet export standards, for getting international certifications, for developing marketing channels abroad. The structure, favoring bulk fertilizer over perhaps specialized inputs for niche export crops, just doesn't align well with export needs.
So what are the main challenges facing Nepalese agricultural exporters, even for those products where they have a good reputation, like cardamom or tea?
The report lays out several key challenges. They face intense global competition, obviously. There are persistent difficulties in consistently meeting the very strict quality and food safety standards demanded by international buyers. Underdeveloped infrastructure, transport, storage, processing adds costs and risks spoilage. Farmers and exporters often have limited market information and lack sophisticated marketing skills. There's a heavy dependence on just a few export markets, especially India, and just not enough diversification in both the products being exported and the markets they're sold to.
But there are opportunities, too. It's not all bleak.
No, definitely not. The report also points to opportunities. There's growing global demand for niche products, organic foods, things with unique origins. Nepal has unique selling points with items like its black cardamom, Himalayan honey, timid paprika.
Right.
Its geographical proximity to massive markets like India and China is an advantage. And there's potential to link agricultural production more strongly with Nepal's growing agritourism sector.
Okay, let's try and bring this all together now. We've looked at technology and subsidies as these two main tools for modernization. How do they actually interact? Is there synergy happening in practice?
Well, in theory, yes, there absolutely should be synergy. Subsidies should help farmers overcome that big financial barrier to adopting new technology.
Makes sense.
And technology, in turn, should make those subsidized inputs like fertilizer much more effective. You get a much better return on investment from that subsidized fertilizer if you're also using high-yielding seeds and efficient irrigation, right?
But the report suggests that synergy just isn't really happening effectively on the ground in Nepal.
Precisely. Those deep systemic problems we've been discussing with both systems, the subsidies and the tech adoption, they prevent that potential synergy from being realized.
How so?
Well, the subsidies often don't reliably reach the farmers who most need help to adopt technology, or the funds get misused. The technology itself is often too expensive, too complex, or just not well adapted to local conditions, even with a subsidy.
Right.
And that missing rural infrastructure, the roads, power, internet repair services, means that even if you subsidize a tractor or a drip irrigation kit, it might not be usable or maintainable in the long run. So just subsidizing technology without fixing these underlying systemic issues, the report indicates it has pretty limited impact.
So what are the big overarching interconnected challenges that seem to be holding back this whole modernization effort? Can we recap those?
Yeah, it really is a complex web. Land fragmentation seems absolutely fundamental. It
Yeah.
makes large-scale investment, mechanization, everything much harder. Climate change vulnerability is a huge and growing threat, requiring costly and specific adaptation measures. Limited access to finance, especially for smallholder farmers, restricts their ability to invest and take risks. There's generally low human capital, a shortage of well-trained farmers, extension workers, technical specialists. Problems with agricultural cooperatives, they're meant to play a key role in aggregating farmers and providing services, but often suffer from inefficiency or governance issues.
Right.
Underdeveloped rural infrastructure, roads, power storage, markets, is a constant drag on efficiency. And then overarching all of this are these institutional weaknesses, policy inconsistencies, bureaucratic hurdles, and, as mentioned, corruption.
And how does that flagship PMAMP project, the one setting up the zones, fit into this picture of challenges? Did the report evaluate it?
It did, and while the PMAMP had ambitious goals and allocated significant funds, including billions in subsidies, the report is actually quite direct in its assessment. It states that, quote, real results are not yet visible, and that implementation has been far from satisfactory. It specifically highlights problems like subsidies not reaching the intended small farmers, and instances of misuse and even embezzlement of project funds. So this gap between the project's ambitious blueprint and its, well, limited real-world impact so far, it really signals these significant systemic problems in how policies are actually implemented on the ground.
Right. So to kind of summarize the key findings from the report, the potential of using technology and subsidies to transform Nepal's agriculture is definitely high, but their effectiveness is being severely limited by this complex knot of interconnected systemic problems.
Yeah.
Food security remains a critical challenge with significant vulnerability and a worrying dependence on imports. Export potential is there, particularly in niche areas, but it's badly hampered by issues around quality, infrastructure, and market access. And the government's major modernization programs, like PMAMP, while ambitious on paper, are facing really serious implementation hurdles and not delivering the expected results yet.
That really captures the essence of the report's analysis. It's a picture of, significant effort and resources being applied, but struggling to gain traction against these deep-seated structural and institutional barriers.
So, given this complex picture, what are the main strategic recommendations coming out of the report? How can Nepal move forward more effectively?
Well, the report outlines several key areas for action, focusing on tackling those systemic issues. First, it calls for a much more comprehensive approach to improving technology policy. Meaning actively addressing all those barriers we discussed together. Vastly improving access to finance for farmers is critical. Investing heavily, consistently in rural infrastructure, better roads, reliable electricity, widespread internet access, adequate storage facilities. It also means seriously upgrading education and training programs, both for farmers on how to use tech and for creating more technical specialists for support and repairs.
And adapting the technology itself, making it suitable.
Absolutely. Not just pushing whatever tech is available, but adapting existing technologies to Nepal's specific conditions and needs and supporting local research and development. Also, developing service markets, like machinery rental centers, could make tech more accessible even for farmers with fragmented land. And supporting digitalization infrastructure and digital literacy is vital if things like precision farming are ever going to take off.
Okay, that makes sense for tech. What about fixing that troubled subsidy system?
The strong recommendation here is to shift towards what they call smart subsidies, move away from the current model of largely untargeted general input subsidies, especially the massive spending on chemical fertilizer,
And shift.
towards focusing support on things that actively stimulate positive change, like adopting sustainable technologies, improving product quality for domestic or export markets, boosting overall farm efficiency, encouraging innovation, maybe even using things like voucher systems to target support better to specific farmers or specific goals.
And transparency, accountability.
Critically important. They recommend radically improving transparency, accountability, and control mechanisms within the subsidy system.
Hmm.
Perhaps using digital tracking tools to follow the money and the inputs to really combat that misuse and corruption. And also, diversifying support beyond just chemical fertilizers, supporting organic inputs, investing in post-harvest infrastructure like storage and processing, which can add a lot of value.
Makes sense. And for strengthening food security specifically, any key recommendations?
Yes, support production diversification. Encourage farmers to grow more micronutrient-rich crops, not just the basic staples, to improve national nutrition levels. Invest heavily and strategically in irrigation and water management, seeing it as crucial for climate adaptation and enabling more dry season farming. Develop agricultural logistics and value chains, better storage, processing, transport to reduce those huge post-harvest losses and get food to markets more efficiently. And importantly, specifically target support towards the most vulnerable regions like Karnali and vulnerable population groups.
And finally, for stimulating that export growth we talked about.
Here, the recommendation is to focus targeted support on high value-added products and those specific niches where Nepal has a comparative advantage, things like the black cardamom, ginger, organic produce. Provide concrete assistance to farmers and exporters in meeting international certification requirements and quality standards.
Right.
Develop specific export-related infrastructure.
Right.
And actively support marketing efforts and market diversification to reduce that heavy reliance on just one or two trading partners.
And underlying all of this,
Underpinning everything, really, is the need for sustainable and inclusive development. Finding ways to seriously address land fragmentation, maybe through carefully managed land consolidation initiatives, or supporting genuinely effective cooperative farming models. Integrating climate change adaptation measures into all agricultural programs. Strengthening farmer organizations and cooperatives, making sure they're well governed and actually serve their members effectively. And ensuring inclusivity, making sure women and youth are actively involved and benefit from these modernization efforts.
it really sounds like the report's main message is that isolated fixes just won't cut it. What's needed is a comprehensive, coordinated, long-term approach that tackles the institutional reforms, builds human capital, creates a supportive ecosystem.
Exactly. And involving the private sector much more actively is also seen as key. The challenges are systemic and deeply interconnected, so the solutions need to be systemic and coordinated too, not just piecemeal fixes here and there.
Well, this deep dive has certainly laid bare the sheer complexity of trying to modernize such a foundational economic sector like agriculture, especially in a country facing Nepal's unique mix of structural, geographical, and environmental challenges.
It really is a fascinating and somewhat sobering case study in the gap that can sometimes exist between ambitious national policies and the messy reality on the ground.
So maybe here's a final thought for you, our listener, to mull over. What does Nepal's journey, as outlined in this report, really teach us about that intricate, often difficult relationship between ambitious government policy, the resources available, the potential offered by technology, and those crucial, often overlooked, real-world challenges faced by the individual farmers who are actually meant to be implementing these changes? And perhaps how might some of the lessons from this deep dive, particularly around things like ineffective subsidies, barriers to technology adoption, and those critical implementation gaps, how might they apply or offer warnings to other countries that are also striving to modernize their own foundational economic sectors?
Definitely some important food for thought there.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you found it insightful.